You know, usually when we talk about a society breaking down, there's this expectation of a visible, violent trigger.
Right, the classic movie scenario.
Exactly. We look at history and we look for the invading army coming over the hill or a massive natural disaster or, I don't know, a sudden catastrophic stock market crash.
You see the ruins of a civilization, and you point to the earthquake, and you say, there it is. That's the moment it all ended.
Yeah, that's what broke us. And it's comforting in a strange way, right?
Oh, absolutely. We desperately want the threats to our world to be visible.
Because if they're external, that implies they are manageable. It makes us feel like if we just build a higher wall or reinforce our buildings with more steel, we're fundamentally safe.
But then you step into the world of social pathology.
Which is exactly where I live. As a social pathologist, I look at the deep underlying mechanics of human civilization. And when you do that, suddenly that simplistic, comforting worldview it shatters completely.
Because the real threats are completely invisible.
Right. We start looking at a diagnostic landscape where the most fatal diseases a society can catch are entirely unseen.
Because, the most dangerous societal collapses almost never arrive from over the horizon. They germinate from within the microscopic social fabric itself.
Long before the walls fall to an outside invader, the mortar holding the bricks together has already turned to dust.
That is exactly the decay we're dissecting today. We're taking a deep dive into a text that functions as a highly detailed, almost radically rational commentary on verses 25 to 29 of Surah 13.
And we should be really clear here for you listening, we aren't looking at this as a purely theological exercise. We are impartially unpacking the philosophical and sociological arguments presented in this specific religious commentary.
Right. We're not endorsing a specific theological worldview. We're just exploring the fascinating mechanics of its arguments.
Exactly. My focus is entirely on the structural mechanics, how communities and societies either degrade into total dysfunction or thrive into high-performance systems. I want to look at the architectural blueprints of human unity.
And more importantly, how we tear those blueprints up. Which brings in my lens as a cognitive scientist. I am constantly fascinated by the underlying psychology of belief systems.
The architecture of cognitive dissonance.
Yes, why human minds are so eager to lock themselves into frameworks that practically guarantee their own misery while aggressively rejecting frameworks built on observable reason.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving right into verse 25.
Yeah.
And it tackles a concept that has been misunderstood for millennia, completely flipped on its head.
The concept of the curse.
Right. The Arabic word lana. Now, if you are sitting in traffic right now or folding laundry and you hear the word curse, what flashes into your mind?
Almost universally, people picture magic.
A supernatural spell. A deity sitting on a cloud getting offended by something a human did and magically turning someone's crops to ash out of sheer vindictive spite.
What anthropologists might call the power of the mountain mentality.
The power of the mountain. I like that.
It's the psychological demand for a supernatural intervention that actively violates the laws of physics. And it serves as an incredibly common psychological crutch.
But wait, why is it a crutch? From a sociological standpoint, humans usually invent these narratives to explain things they don't understand.
Sure, if a drought happens and you don't understand atmospheric pressure systems, blaming an angry god makes sense as an early explanatory tool.
But it becomes a crutch because it completely absolves human beings of systemic responsibility.
Exactly. If the society fails because the gods are angry, there's nothing structural you could have done to prevent it, other than perhaps sacrificing a goat.
Which is much easier than fixing a systemic issue.
The text we are analyzing today aggressively strips away this magical safety net. It frames this curse not as a spell, but as systemic entropy.
It describes a natural, immutable law of cause and effect. It grounds this in the concept of a covenant, but not a mystical string between a human and a deity.
No, it defines the covenant as the foundational unity of humanity itself.
That unity is the covenant. The text argues that the natural state, the evolutionary imperative, is one unified human community, an ummah wajida.
And to really understand what happens when you violate that, we need an analogy.
Think about a massive suspension bridge. Picture the Golden Gate Bridge. You have these massive concrete towers, the sweeping main cables, the suspender cables, and the heavy steel deck.
All distinct, disparate elements.
Bound together by the unforgiving laws of structural engineering. They distribute tension and compression. They act as one single body to carry the load.
That structural unity is the only thing keeping the cars out of the water.
Exactly. Now, What happens if you take a pair of bolt cutters and start deliberately snapping the suspender cables? What happens if you intentionally separate the deck from the main cables?
The bridge collapses.
But here is the crucial realization. The physical law of gravity didn't get angry at the bridge.
Right.
The universe didn't magically punish the metal for being bad. The collapse is simply the natural, mathematically inevitable consequence of severing the connections.
The structural entropy is the curse.
Yes. The text argues that if you break the covenant of a society, if you sever the unity of a community and split humanity into warring, isolated, tribal fragments, the society naturally collapses.
Into deep corruption and violence.
The Arabic term Fasad, that natural, inevitable collapse of the social structure, the bridge falling into the river, that is the curse.
The curse is just the diagnostic term for the systemic entropy that human beings triggered by breaking their own structural connections.
It entirely shifts the locus of responsibility onto human action. It forces us to look in the mirror.
If your society is experiencing the curse of widespread corruption and staggering inequality, it is not because you failed to chant the right magical incantations.
It's because you fundamentally violated the structural engineering of human unity. You went out there with bolt cutters.
But if we know that unity is the only thing keeping the deck out of the water, why on earth do we keep cutting the cables?
This takes us straight into the anatomy of the collapse, segment 1. The text goes into this forensic detail about the social pathogen that causes us to do this.
It defines this breaking of the covenant explicitly as the deliberate creation of sects, factions, and divisions.
It argues humanity was given a universal blueprint for one single community. But we have an infinite capacity to take a beautiful blueprint and shatter it into thousands of warring little tribes.
Which brings us to the cognitive barrier of sectarianism. Creating a faction isn't just about drawing a line on a map.
It's a cognitive wall in your own mind.
Exactly. When you divide humanity, you don't just divide geography. You divide resources, and crucially, you begin to hoard truth.
What's fascinating here is how the text points out this psychological phenomenon. When sects form, every single group rejoices in what they have.
They develop an intense, intoxicating in-group favoritism. They become entirely convinced that they possess the exclusive monopoly on ultimate truth.
And everyone outside their tiny echo chamber circle is eternally doomed. Freud called it the narcissism of small differences.
Right, we don't hate the people who are totally different from us.
We viciously hate the people who are 99% identical to us but disagree on one tiny detail.
But wait, from a sociological perspective, aren't micro-communities just how human brains function?
Like Dunbar's number.
Yeah. We can only really handle caring about maybe 150 people. Isn't this sectarianism just a natural biological limit, not necessarily a malicious choice?
It is a biological tendency, sure. Evolutionary psychology tells us we prefer the safety of a small in-group. But a tendency is not an inevitability.
Especially for a conscious, reasoning species. The problem is cognitive load.
Say more about that.
Well, it requires very little mental effort to say, my specific tribe is saved, and the other 8 billion human beings are fundamentally flawed and doomed.
It's a cheap, easy dopamine hit of superiority.
Exactly. Universalism. The idea that every human life holds equal weight, and that we must construct systems that care for the stranger as much as the brother, that is cognitively exhausting.
It requires empathy, massive systemic planning, a constant overriding of our primitive instincts.
Sectarianism is intellectual laziness disguised as purity.
And the text gives us some incredible, almost darkly comedic historical examples of this intellectual laziness.
It really does. It describes how this psychological division links directly to fasad fi all-ord corruption in the earth.
The commentator talks about his historical reality, looking at two factions that essentially share the exact same theological DNA, the Hanafis and the Al-Hadi.
Groups that, to an outsider, are practically indistinguishable.
Indistinguishable. But instead of focusing on the massive overarching directives of their shared worldview, like eliminating poverty or establishing justice, what do?
They go to literal physical war over microscopic cosmetic details.
For example, they get into a massive societal tearing conflict over whether a person should say the word Amin loudly or softly during a communal prayer.
It sounds absurd to a modern ear, but the psychology behind it is incredibly dark. It escalates from a disagreement to utter madness. The text outlines how a debate over the decibel level of a single word means they suddenly refuse to stand in the same building.
They start putting literal padlocks on the doors.
Padlocks on community centers to keep the other group out. Then the physical violence starts. Fists are thrown, blood is drawn over the volume of a whisper.
The police have to be called in.
Lawsuits are filed in civil courts. It mentions a specific incident in Calcutta where a cleric from one faction was released from jail after a bitter lawsuit over these exact petty differences.
And his followers threw a massive public parade in the streets to celebrate their victory.
A victory parade over the volume of a syllable.
If we go back to your bridge analogy,
Yeah.
this is the ultimate manifestation of systemic entropy. The main cables are snapping, the deck is groaning and twisting, ready to plunge into the abyss.
And the people standing on the bridge are throwing a ticker tape parade because they successfully sued another group of passengers over who gets to claim ownership of a single decorative rivet.
That is exactly it. They are celebrating a rivet while the entire structure collapses beneath their feet.
And while they are consumed by this hyper-focus on microscopic rituals, policing exactly where someone places their hands, they intentionally ignore the overarching directives of their philosophy.
The directives to feed the hungry, care for the vulnerable.
Because it is a classic, deeply effective form of cognitive misdirection.
By obsessing over the micro-rituals, they excuse themselves from the macro responsibilities.
It is exponentially easier to aggressively police the volume of your neighbor's voice than it is to look at the staggering economic inequality in your city and realize you have to sacrifice your own comfort to fix it.
One requires a quick, self-righteous rebuke. The other requires systemic sacrifice, structural overhaul, and exhausting labor.
And when you start hoarding truth, when you say, we are the chosen few and everyone else is wrong, it's only a matter of time before you apply that exact same psychology to physical resources.
Which brings us to segment 2, the engine of reason, or the physics of provision.
The mechanism that causes a group to hoard an identity is the exact same mechanism that breaks down a macroeconomy. The text steps away from pure sociology and drops straight into economic theory here.
It tackles verse 26 regarding the expansion and restriction of provision,
Which historically is usually read as a divine lottery. God arbitrarily handing out massive wealth to one person just because he favors them, and plunging another into grinding poverty as a test.
entirely framed as arbitrary divine whim. And the text fiercely dismantles that interpretation.
Because if the distribution of wealth is simply a divine whim, human agency is zero.
The concept of a rational, observable universe completely collapses. If the deity is just pulling levers at random, science is impossible. Economics is impossible.
You're just waiting for lightning to strike, basically.
Right. So the text reinterprets God's will in this context entirely. It argues that God's will is actually a metaphor for the immutable, unbending economic and physical laws of the universe.
The law of Rububiyat, a system of nourishment and development. It's a highly predictable mechanical engine of cause and effect.
And to ground this, the text uses a brilliant agricultural analogy, the two farmers.
Let's lay that out. Imagine two farmers. The first farmer is a staunch, unapologetic atheist. He entirely rejects the concept of the supernatural.
Okay.
But this farmer wakes up before dawn every day. He studies the chemical composition of his soil. He meticulously selects the highest yielding seeds.
He plows the land, engineers a perfect irrigation system, uses scientifically proven pest control.
According to the physical laws of nature, this law of Rububiyat, what is the inevitable result?
That farmer is going to reap a massive harvest. The physical laws of the universe operate with absolute, unflinching impartiality.
The soil does not demand a theological purity test.
Yep.
Carbon, nitrogen, and water interact based on chemistry, not on the beliefs of the person holding the watering can.
Exactly. Now look at the second farmer. Let's say he is universally recognized as the most devout believer in his entire community.
Holds all the correct theological views.
But he sits inside his house all day. He doesn't test the soil, buys inferior seeds, doesn't dig an irrigation ditch.
He just unrolls a prayer mat and chants for 12 hours a day, begging the universe to grant him a bountiful harvest.
The universe grants him a barren field. Yields 0.
But wait, if you're a listener right now who holds a deep faith, you might be thinking, hold on, isn't prayer supposed to do something? Isn't he asking for a bit of supernatural luck?
The text argues that the moment you rely on the prayer to alter the physics, you've abandoned the law.
If the universe magically grew crops for the lazy believer, the universe would be chaotic, irrational.
The text points out a profound irony we see globally. When societies that loudly label themselves as believers abandon reason, ignore science, and neglect physical effort.
Hoping for magical interventions.
Exactly. They inevitably end up deeply impoverished. Meanwhile, societies that might completely discard religious labels but strictly adhere to physical laws and scientific inquiry end up generating immense wealth.
The expansion of provision. So if the atheist farmer does the work, physics dictates the harvest. The law of nature is totally blind to your internal beliefs.
But this introduces a massive complication.
Right, because growing the crops is only step one.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, acquiring wealth relies on physical laws. But distributing that wealth relies on moral and sociological laws.
The distribution trap. Let's explore that, because you could have a society that is absolutely brilliant at the physical laws.
They embrace science, engineer incredible technologies, build massive factories.
They optimize their supply chains and generate a staggering amount of GDP. They have mastered the physical side of the equation.
But, and here's the trap, if that same society has broken the covenant, if their social fabric is deeply fractured into warring classes or ideological sects, what happens to all that wealth?
They hoard it. The text argues that a fractured society will inevitably funnel all that generated wealth exclusively into their own narrow elite in-group.
The commentary uses a visceral, striking phrase. It describes this system as capitalists squeezing the last drop of blood from the sweat of the poor to construct their own infinitely comfortable lives.
So they succeed wildly in production, but fail catastrophically in distribution. They create an artificial economy.
Artificial scarcity is the hallmark of a broken covenant. You end up with a society where massive, climate-controlled storehouses are bursting with surplus grain, while human beings are literally starving to death on the sidewalk right outside.
The text views this hoarding not just as a minor flaw, but as the ultimate terminal societal failure. It says this engineered inequality results in the society wearing a garment of fear and hunger.
A garment of fear and hunger.
That imagery is so deeply unsettling. It implies it covers everything, woven into the very fabric of their daily existence.
And notice the brilliant psychological insight here. It's not just the starving people wearing the garment.
Oh, right.
Even the incredibly wealthy in this hoarding society are suffocating under the garment of fear. They have all the physical resources, but they live in hyper-securitized, gated communities.
They hire armed guards, install biometric locks.
Why? Because they are perpetually terrified that the starving masses they exploited will eventually realize the math, rise up, and take what was hoarded.
They destroy external societal security and their own internal psychological peace. They have massive wealth, but absolutely zero societal tranquility.
They've triggered the curse of entropy despite having a surplus of resources, all because they took bolt cutters to the structural cables of equitable distribution.
Wealth without equity is just a very expensive form of societal collapse.
Exactly.
So if you're listening to this, a glaring, flashing red question has to be going off in your head right now.
I know what you're going to ask.
If the laws of nature are this starkly predictable, if planting the seed yields a crop, and if hoarding wealth inevitably causes society to collapse in terror, why do people accept broken, factionalized systems?
Why don't the masses just look at the glaring evidence, reject the artificial scarcity, and restructure society?
Exactly. We're rational creatures, supposedly.
Because of the invisible sword. Segment 3, the psychology of coercion.
The text introduces the concept of ikra, which translates to coercion. Now, usually when we hear coercion, we picture physical violence.
A tyrant holding a sharpened steel sword to a peasant's neck. Believe my ideology, give me your grain, or I will execute you right now.
That's the most primitive form, yes, but highly inefficient, because the moment the tyrant drops the sword, the peasant rebels.
The text outlines a mechanism that is far more insidious and far more common. Psychological coercion.
The immense invisible pressure of the social collective.
The terror of losing your social standing. The dread of being the outlier.
The text uses a fantastic local idiom for this that I absolutely love. The fear of having your hookah and water cut off.
It perfectly encapsulates the concept. In that cultural context, sharing the hookah and having access to the communal water source was the very definition of belonging to the society.
It's the ultimate symbol of social excommunication. If they cut your hookah and water, you are completely excised from communal life.
No one will trade with you. No one will speak to you. Your children won't be able to marry.
It is the equivalent of modern-day cancel culture, but with literal survival stakes attached.
It is social death.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to remember our evolutionary biology here. We are fundamentally hardwired to fear social death almost as much as physical death.
Because in our ancient past, being cast out of the tribe meant you would freeze or starve in the wilderness.
That neurological wiring is still intact. If standing up and declaring this economic hoarding is mathematically destroying us means that your community will cut off your hookah and water.
Meaning you lose your friends, your reputation, your business contacts.
What do most people do?
They stay silent, they swallow their doubts, they ignore the cognitive dissonance, and they voluntarily submit to the irrational system.
They eagerly put on the blindfold because the alternative is being completely alone in the dark.
This psychological coercion is exactly how a society forces brilliant, capable human minds to actively support utterly illogical, self-destructive systems.
But wait, isn't submitting your own intellect to the will of the tradition often framed as a virtue?
Right. Historically, faith is praised when it is blind. The guy who asks no questions and just obeys the dogma is celebrated as the most pious.
The traditional narrative absolutely frames it that way because it serves the power structure. But the source text we are analyzing completely detonates that idea.
So what does this all mean?
It redefines what it actually means to be a believer, a total paradigm shift. It argues that a believer is explicitly not someone who falls down like a deaf and blind person when presented with a scripture.
That is a direct, uncompromising strike against blind faith. The text calls out mindless obedience not as piety, but as self-deception.
It argues that true faith fundamentally requires the aggressive use of intellect, reason, and empirical evidence.
Because you cannot force a rational, scientifically oriented mind to achieve inner peace by demanding they swallow something that violates their reason.
Think about an astrophysicist, someone who maps the predictable trajectories of galaxies. If you order them to believe that the universe is governed by the magical whims of a moody deity,
Their brain will involuntarily reject it.
it causes intense cognitive friction. They might say they believe it out loud just to keep their job or stay in the community.
Just to keep their hookah and water.
But internally, they know it's a lie. That is not faith. That is ikra, psychological coercion.
Belief without intellectual rigorousness is just a form of cowardly societal appeasement. True conviction only happens when the intellect is fully rationally satisfied.
Which brings us to a brilliant linguistic deep dive in the text. Segment 4, verse 28 states, "Hearts finding rest in the remembrance of Allah."
I grew up seeing the traditional narrative around this phrase. The word remembrance, or zikr in Arabic, is almost exclusively reduced to repetitive vocal chanting.
The image of an ascetic sitting in a corner with prayer beads.
Right. You sit there, repeat a single phrase thousands of times, attempting to induce a trance-like state. And that temporary numbness is labeled as peace.
But the source text we are looking at utterly dismantles this chanting narrative. It views it as a severe misinterpretation of human psychology.
The rest, or peace, described in verse 28, is absolutely not a hypnotic trance. It is what I like to call the intellectual click.
The intellectual click.
It's that profound, overwhelming rush of psychological relief a human mind experiences when the incredibly complex pieces of the universe finally fit together into a coherent picture.
When you realize the universe isn't a terrifying lottery of magic, but is governed by a consistent, predictable law.
Exactly. Consider the immense cognitive load of believing in a chaotic universe. If you think the rules change every single day,
If a storm might mean you didn't chant enough, or a disease means your ancestors are angry at you, you are living in a state of constant, exhausting terror.
you're perpetually trying to guess what obscure magic words will keep you safe.
But when you realize there is an immutable law, if I plant a seed, it grows. If we share our resources, society stabilizes. The cognitive relief is staggering.
That deeply rational click of understanding is the heart finding rest. And to illustrate what this true zikr actually looks like, the text uses a stunningly practical analogy.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
The driving analogy. Imagine you are driving a car at high speed down a busy highway. The fundamental law of the road is keep to the left.
Now, how do you actively remember that law? Do you close your eyes, let go of the wheel, and just chant out loud, keep to the left, keep to the left?
If you do that, you're crashing into a concrete barrier within 30 seconds.
Because chanting the law isn't the same as driving by the law.
The text argues that true zikr, true remembrance, is when you have internalized the law so deeply into your subconscious architecture that you don't even have to waste breath speaking it.
Your hands automatically steer the wheel to the left. When a hazard appears, your muscle memory instantly reacts to keep you safe.
That constant, active, silent subconscious alignment with the law while you navigate reality, that is true remembrance.
In cognitive science, we call this the transition from declarative memory to procedural memory. Declarative memory is stating a rule out loud. Procedural memory is physically embodying the rule.
When the rational law of the universe is embedded in your procedural memory, you don't need a dark room and a chant to feel peace.
Your peace is durable. It comes from the profound knowing that your daily choices are perfectly aligned with reality.
And the text layers another analogy on top of this, a highly poetic biological analogy to explain the word anab, which translates to turn towards.
The text compares the human mind seeking truth to a honeybee.
It's a brilliant illustration of inherent natural alignment versus forced compliance. Think about a honeybee. It flies thousands of miles over its lifetime through the vast, chaotic sky.
It extracts microscopic drops of nectar. And when its payload is full, how does it get back?
There are no signposts floating in the sky, no GPS maps. But the bee finds its way perfectly back to its singular hive. How?
Because it naturally, biologically orientates itself to the overarching laws of nature. It possesses an internal compass aligned with electromagnetic fields.
It doesn't have to panic or debate theology with the other bees. It simply aligns its internal mechanism with external reality and flies.
And the text is making a massive claim here. The human mind is designed with the exact same capacity for alignment.
If we strip away the psychological coercion, drop the fear of losing our hookah and water, and look at the universe objectively, our intellect will naturally orient itself toward the overarching law.
It will naturally seek cause and effect, justice, and human unity. True peace comes from allowing that alignment instead of forcing the mind into contortions.
Which seamlessly carries us to the absolute culmination of this entire journey. Verse 29, the macro-sociological question. What happens when an entire society achieves this intellectual click?
This leads us to the concept of tuba.
Now, traditionally in folklore, tuba is depicted as a literal physical tree growing in a mystical paradise, or a vague term for spiritual bliss in the afterlife.
But the expert commentary drags this concept right back down to earth.
It defines tuba not as an ethereal dreamscape, but as a perfectly balanced, high-performance society existing right here in the brutal physical world.
The ultimate societal output when intellectual and physical inputs are calibrated correctly.
The text provides a literal equation for achieving tuba. Verse 29 links two concepts, belief and righteous deeds.
But we cannot use the traditional definitions. Belief is not blind faith. It is deep, rational conviction in the universal law.
And righteous deeds are not just arbitrary personal religious rituals like fasting. They are the physical, systemic, economic implementation of that law.
So the equation is rational conviction plus systemic implementation equals tuba, the high-performance society.
This raises an important question. What happens if a society attempts to construct this reality with only half of the equation?
Let's look at conviction without implementation. Picture a society full of brilliant academics. They perfectly understand the laws of economics. They logically know that hoarding resources triggers entropy.
But they don't do anything about it. They sit in coffee shops debating equity, but they never change the tax laws. They never dismantle the gated communities.
Exactly. Conviction without physical implementation is merely abstract theory. It's useless. A perfect understanding of structural engineering does not stop a bridge from collapsing if you refuse to tighten the bolts.
Theory does not feed a starving child. Okay, now let's flip it. What if you have implementation without conviction?
A highly authoritarian society where a powerful government forces everyone to share resources equally. They mandate universal housing.
But the people on the ground don't actually believe in it. They haven't experienced the intellectual click. They are just obeying because there's a sword at their necks.
That is coerced action, the return of Iqra. And forced systemic implementation without underlying intellectual conviction inevitably violently collapses.
Because human beings deeply resent being treated like unthinking cogs in a machine. You cannot legislate the heart finding rest.
They need to rationally understand the why, or they will eventually sabotage the how.
So, tuba, this high-performance society, happens only when a society aligns its deep intellectual understanding of the universe's rational laws with the actual physical implementation of sharing resources.
When the internal psychology of the individual and the external physics of the society lock into total harmony, that is tuba.
A society with absolutely no fear, no hunger, and no sectarian warfare.
It is the magnificent suspension bridge carrying a massive load effortlessly enduring any storm.
This has been an incredibly dense journey. We moved from seeing societal collapse as a breakdown of human unity to understanding economics as an immutable law rather than divine whim.
We redefined faith as an intellectual awakening rather than blind chanting.
And it culminated in the blueprint for a high-performance society. But of course, human nature is incredibly frustratingly stubborn.
Oh, absolutely.
Which brings us to the profound contradiction we are going to tackle in our next deep dive. If this law of requital is so absolute and mathematically beneficial, why do people continually reject it?
Why do they fight so hard to stay in the dark when the light switch is right next to them?
The source text points out that even when presented with this perfect rational system, the disbelievers still demand physical magic tricks.
They aren't satisfied with a functioning economy. They demand that a messenger literally break the moon in half in the sky.
Or turn a handful of animal hair into flowing milk right in front of their eyes.
Yeah.
Next time, we will explore this cognitive dissonance.
The human obsession with the power of the mountain, supernatural magic versus the power of the word. The quiet power of intellect, reason, and law.
It's the battle between wanting to be effortlessly saved by a magic trick versus accepting the exhausting, unglamorous hard work of aligning our societies with reality.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over, based on everything we've unpacked today about the unbending nature of cause and effect. If your peace of mind relies on the secret hope that the universe will bend its rules specifically to save you, are you actually seeking the truth, or are you just desperately seeking a cosmic loophole? What would change in your world if, starting today, you stopped scanning the sky for miracles and started doing the hard physical work of perfectly aligning your actions with the unbending laws of cause and effect?